Linkin Park, they were my favorite band growing up. This was the song that got me into them. Now they're back making music, so I gave myself about a day and a half or so to recreate this and get in their headspace of just their writing and production style. And I thought it might be useful just to kind of share some of the things that I learned through this and give you just kind of a run through of the overall sound. So here's what it sounds like. So let's get started and dive right in with the guitars. The guitars are a huge part of the nu metal sound that Linkin Park was one of the huge forerunners of. So with this, Brad Delson, their guitarist, around this era, he played a PRS guitar with just dual humbucker setup from what I remember through a Mesa Boogie amp. So that's basically kind of what I've got going through here. I've got two double-tracked sets of just guitar takes here through a Mesa Boogie amp, and then I've also double-tracked these with a Marshall-type amp as well to kind of blend that in. So here's what those sound like just in isolation, and then I've got this little, you can see there's this lead in here, which is just a couple of, little notes kind of leading into the chorus. So here's what the guitars sound like in isolation by themselves. So to get that nu metal tone, a Mesa Boogie is definitely the way to go. If you go with a dual rectifier like I've got here, I've just double-tracked these. I'm using the IK Multimedia Amplitude plugin, their Mesa Boogie suite. You can see I've got the gain maxed out, treble maxed out. Mids are at the middle, but this is already kind of a scoop sound anyway. The bass is actually rolled off a little bit more than you would think. The bass and the low end from a lot of their songs is actually due to the bass guitar, not the actual guitars themselves. So cutting this out a little bit helps the guitars and the bass guitar mesh a little bit better. So if we listen to this one, where I've got the Mesas, and then I've also got a double track set up here that I ran through my Ibanez RG series with the humbucker. This is just going through a Marshall style amp, and this I have running through the Neural DSP Fort Nameless, so it's just a hot rodded Marshall emulation basically. Again, bass rolled off, mids pushed a little higher, and then the treble rolled off a little bit more. My Ibanez I actually have tuned down a little bit, so I transposed this up 2 semitones just so it was in the same key. So if we listen to what just the Mesa Boogie guitars are doing that I recorded with my Telecaster, here's what these sound like in isolation. So real thick, saturated, highly distorted sound. And actually, there's two different things being played here. So here's just this is in drop D. So these two tracks right here, just the rhythm tracks, just doing the notes on here. Just basically open bar chords. This is doubled with an octave track. So playing the same notes, just an octave higher. So that way, when you play all four of them together, you get this really cool voicing that you hear in a lot of nu metal and a lot of Linkin Park song like this. So that's what these sound like. Just makes it sound like it's a thicker chord, especially when you blend this in with the Marshall type amp. It gives you that thicker sound. Now, the Mesa Boogies have kind of a scooped mid-range, but they offer a lot of that like real thick saturation that this genre is known for. So to blend them with a Marshall type amp that has a real forward mid-range, you get kind of the best of both worlds sonically. So you get that cut through the mix with the Marshall, but you get that real like thick kind of in-your-face tone from the Mesa Boogies. So if we listen to just the Marshall, you'll hear that this sounds a little cleaner than the Mesa Boogie amp, the dual rectifier, and it's really just simple notes just on the bottom 3 strings, just kind of strung out one per measure. So here's what this one sounds like. And then combine back in with the Telecaster that I put through the Mesa Boogie. And something that I found really interesting in recreating this is that in a lot of modern rock productions, double tracking guitars isn't anything new. It's been done for ages, and it's something that makes your guitar sound really thick. And that was one of the huge kind of like, glass shattering, eye opening moments that I learned early on in production. But with these, you'll notice that these are not panned hard left and hard right. These are only panned about halfway. So if you listen to this, or when you listen to this, it's not as wide as what you would think is what you would normally go to do. I know when I record guitars, usually I just do a double take, pan one hard left, one hard right, and then call it a day, as long as they're in sync and played well, obviously. So it was kind of interesting to me because these ones they're not straight down the middle, but they're not as wide as they normally would be if it were mixed by, today's standards, I feel like. But later on, after I added in some of the other elements in this, I realized that was more than likely a conscious decision by the mix engineer and or the band, just because there's so much else going on in the background here that keeping the guitars a little more narrow gives you more stereo width to play around with some of the other sound effects that you've got going on. So with the guitars, again, that's just kind of a Mesa Boogie that I've used in here. I've got the dual rectifier on both of these, playing the root notes. And then I've got the group of the octaves just to harmonize with that. And then I'm running the rest through this one, just through a Marshall. On the groups here themselves, I'm just doing some EQing out of some harsher frequencies, especially with a dual rectifier. It can get a little scratchy in the top ends, really with software amps as well. And then with the Fortin Nameless, I believe I'm just doing a little bit of the opposite, actually boosting some of the treble around 8K, which is a Chris Lord algae trick. I think just 8K on everything, actually. And then taking out a little around, 700 or so? Yeah, about 750, just to get some of that nasally sound out. So as I mentioned, a lot of the low end in this genre and in this song actually comes from the bass. So if we listen to the bass here, this is what the bass sounds like by itself. I just played this through a Fender Jazz bass on the neck pickup just because it sounded a little more rounded. Their bassist Phoenix played, from what I remember, on a Music Man bass, which has just a humbucking pickup. So it's got a little less treble output, and it's got a little thicker tone. So being that I have a jazz bass that's a little more kind of punchy, especially in the bridge position, this was all through the neck pickup. So it sounded a little more smooth and just, kind of naturally rounded out. And then I did some EQ moves here as well. But this is what the bass sounds like by itself. So if we put that in with now the Mesa Boogies, you've now got more of that full spectrum being covered. Still sounds pretty scooped in the mid-range, but then once we bring in the Marshalls, that's where you get more of that cut that really brings it through, which is helpful for just making it sound super thick, but you also don't want it to get buried in the mix. So for the bass here, not really doing anything too fancy. Just have an EQ that I have on every channel that isn't really doing anything for this. Doing some compression on the way in. It's doing like 20 decibels. So that's rounding that out. This is going into the Universal Audio Ampeg SVT. Just again, because this was on a jazz bass, which has more treble output, I'm rolling down the treble. Otherwise, volume and bass are just at noon, so nothing, super fancy here. It's just a clean, round bass tone, which works really well given the distorted nature of the guitars. Doing some multi-band compression. See, it's really just kind of 3 bands on here. It's got the lows, the low mids, and then basically everything from 500 up. Doing a little bit more compression, Universal Audio LA2A. This is doing 5 to 10 decibels. The LA2As also add a little bit more kind of harmonic excitement too, so those can help to really thicken out bass tones. A little bit of EQing. This, I've taken out everything, just done a shelf above, I don't know what. I guess that's 1.5 kilohertz, boosting about 5 decibels. So to get back some of that treble. And then nothing really else on here. And then this, I'm just doing a little bit of widening with this chorus bass. I've got the dry wet at 20, so you only hear about 20% of the effect, but just with and without. So with and without. A little more straight and narrow, right down the center. Turning that on kind of widens it a little bit. That's an old mixing trick. There's a hardware device, I forget what. I want to say it's an Eventide, but there was a preset that you could run a bass guitar through or any kind of bass, and it just gives it a little bit more stereo energy just by the nature of what the chorus does. So that's kind of what's going on in here. So now if we go to finish up listening to the instrumentation that's going on in the chorus, the last thing that's playing here is the acoustic live drums. So I'll play this in isolation. What you can listen out here for is the kind of openness and natural sounding of these drums. This is something that was real prevalent in music and rock music, alternative, and nu metal in the early 2000s. A lot of this sound was really prioritizing and leaning heavily on the overhead microphones and the room microphones. So you get that full kit capture and then augmenting those microphones with the direct mics. So it's kind of the opposite of what we're hearing now in a lot of modern rock, which is just relying more on the direct mics to get that really super punchy and aggressive sound, which can give you a really cool tone. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just, kind of different genres. And then using the overheads and the room mics, just duck down a little lower in the mix so you don't hear quite as much of that cymbal coverage. But in particular, Linkin Park and a lot of bands around this era, a lot of the snare sound actually comes from the overheads and the room tone. So if you don't have that higher up in the mix, you miss out on a lot of those overtones and the natural kind of decay of the snare drum. So if I play the drums in isolation, I'm going to mute one of the samples I'm using here, just which I will get into in a moment. Here's what those drums sound like on their own. So you can hear they're pretty natural and open sounding. You get a full frequency coverage of the whole kit. It doesn't really sound like anything is too mismatched or misbalanced. So if I look at the drum room here that I'm using, I don't have a great drum room at the moment to record in, so I'm actually just using the microphones that I have and sending them to a kind of fake room. I'm doing this in Guitar Rig 6, which probably sounds crazy at face value, but there's a really cool plug-in module inside of Guitar Rig called Little Reflector. I think it's basically just an impulse response module, so it's kind of a reverb. But this medium setting on here sounds really nice as just kind of a natural sounding room. So here's what that sounds like on its own. So I've just got that tucked in the mix. I think that I've got that about 6 decibels down originally where I had that. And then if I go to the overheads, here's what these sound like. So you can hear with the overheads, there's basically no kick drum coming through those. I have this high passed at about 150, 138 hertz right here. So it's cutting out a lot of the low end just to allow for the kick to come in and not have any phase cancellation in that. But I'm also running Soothe here first. This is a really cool plugin. This basically kind of acts as a suppressant for really harsh frequencies. I've got it on the preset of Cymbal Smooth, which is, I think, a preset by Nolly, who's great engineer, one of my favorite producers. So essentially what this does is it cuts out all those harsh kind of overtones that you get in recording cymbals. So here's what it sounds like with and without Soothe. So without. It's a little more kind of clangy. And actually, if I click this delta button, it'll let you hear exactly what it's taking out when it's playing. So this is what it's taking out. So a lot of not great frequencies. And you can adjust how much of that this is taking out. So I've got the depth, how much it's taking out, 6.9% out of 10, I believe. So I'm doing some compression. This is basically just kind of evening out the snare hits on here. You'll see this will engage every time the snare hits. Doing a little bit of EQ here. For this, I'm actually cutting out a little bit of 8K and above because I felt the overheads were just a little bright for the song. And then I'm doing a little bit out around about 750, I believe, about 700. And then this auto filter and utility, I'm really only using in this section that leads into the chorus, and all that's really doing is it's automating that so that it fades in from the electronic drums that come in the verses, and that naturally comes into the acoustic drums that play in the chorus, which is something that was a lot of fun to kind of figure out how to do that on here. So here's what that sounds like leading into this. Actually, I'll go ahead and unmute the electronic drums. Let me do that again. So those are really just there to kind of fade those acoustic drums in a little more naturally. So with that, I'm not doing anything, special processing wise than I do in my other sessions with any of the other direct mics. You'll notice that the kick out is the primary kick drum here. I'm using a CAD Audio kick drum mic. It's their CAD Live. I believe it's the D88. And this is just a nice, really kind of round kick drum sound that matched what the song called for. A little bit of compression here. Just evening out the hits. And the kick in microphone, this is real low in the mix comparatively. This is just adding a little bit of attack. So blended in with both kick mics. I'm not even doing any additional EQ. I'm just doing some subtractive EQ to get out some of the frequencies. This delay I only have on here because I wanted to time align these. The phase coherency was just a little bit off. This was because the kick in microphone is closer to the beater. This was happening a little before the kick out, so I just kind of listened by ear and kind of manually time aligned it. So those are playing together, snare top and snare bottom. This was a real important thing for this particular sound. I actually used a Slingerland copper over brass, or steel over brass, I believe, snare drum. Reason for that being, this had a thinner head on it. I believe it was a 1-ply head that I used on this, and it's got a nice ring to it. So typically with these, I'll kind of mute some of the overtones by using a moon gel or something, or a gate. But you can kind of hear with the overheads and just the snare top, you hear a little bit more of that ring with the overtones here. And then especially with the snare bottom mixed in there too, you get a little more of that snap from the snare wires. And with the overheads. So it's a nice snappy snappy snare sound. That's a mouthful. And this is especially important for a lot of this nu metal genre. You'll hear this in, like Korn or Limp Bizkit too, that their snares are tuned a little bit higher than we're hearing nowadays. They're not typically quite as muffled, so you get more of that overtone that helps kind of cut through the mix a little bit and sound a little more ringy. And I'm really not using I don't think I'm using any snare reverb on this. It's really just the drum room sound and the overheads on there. So a lot of this is an intentional thing going into, if you're recording live drums, going into the session, pre-picking out how the drums are going to sound, because you want to capture them as close as possible to the sound that you want to have for your final sound, rather than having to kind of fix it in the mix, because it's really hard, if not impossible, to add, kind of fake overtones to a super dead sounding snare. So I had a lot of fun just kind of playing around with this drum sound. And what I learned listening back from this, again, if we listen to just all the drums by themselves, it's a very natural sounding drum. There's actually this sample in here that I heard in the original version that I just called white noise snare, and it sounds like this. It's just a white noise sample. And this is playing every time the snare is hitting. So it adds a little bit more snap to it. Now, this is actually a trick that the mix engineer for this album, Andy Wallace, used quite a bit in a lot of his work, and I believe still uses. The kind of concept and idea behind this is that the snare triggers a burst of white noise. And what that essentially does is make it a little bit more just kind of snappy sounding. It gives a burst of static, essentially, is what white noise is. It's just kind of all frequencies played at once. So having that come in super short, and you can even hear on this sample, it's not long at all. I don't have any, no, I do have some reverb on it, but if I take the reverb off, this is what the sample sounds like. So it's a real short, just kind of quick impact right there. And then with the reverb, I'm just using the Native Instruments ROM reverb. I've got that pretty low in the mix still. But basically what that does is it adds a little bit more snap to the snare, and that also helps really blend it in with the electronic drums that we've got going on in the chorus. So overall, I'm not doing anything too new with my drum processing. I've kind of got this down to the way I've just kind of used it for several years. A little bit of EQ on here. Typically boost a little bit of the top end and then take out a little bit around 700. For this session, I was boosting a little around 50 just to get a little more low end out of it. And then using the API 2500 from Universal Audio. This is an awesome sounding drum compressor. So here's what this sounds like with and without. Just adds a lot of snap to it. And especially brings out the snare a little bit more in volume there too. So next, speaking of drums, we're going to go over to the electronic drums. And something I didn't really realize until more recently, when I was growing up listening to this, it was just, drums are playing through the whole song. So while that's accurate, the drums in the verse and really up to the chorus are all electronic program drums. So this was a lot of fun to program and kind of figure out because they use a lot of really neat techniques in here that you wouldn't think out of a traditional rock band. So we'll go ahead and take a look at these real quick. So the electronic drums, if I go ahead and play just leading into this section so you can hear kind of what it sounds like coming out of the first chorus. Here's what it sounds like. So as you can see, there's a lot of different layers going on here in the electronic drums that have been programmed here. So started out, I'm just using a single kick sample. This is really just kind of something that I wanted to find that was close to the original sound in the track. It's just a kick sample from the PML library, Production Music Live. I cut off a little bit of the initial transient just to make it a little more rounded on the attack side, and then ducked out a good bit of low end because it's had a lot of low end in it. And then added a little bit of distortion through this little radiator plugin. So here's what the kick sample sounds like by itself. If I just loop this section here. And then without, with. So you get a little bit of distortion in that, and that helps kind of make it a little bit more analog sounding, you can say. And that helps really kind of glue everything together and blend it in when you've got this many samples. And then on the electronic drum bus, I'm actually running everything through the decapitator. And just real quick before we get into the rest, I'll let you hear what that sounds like. So with this on, without. So it adds a little bit more grit. You get that harmonics added in there as well. So you can see in here that I've got, I believe, 5 snares in this first part. Here's what these sound like. And this was fun because there are a lot of sounds going on to achieve the snare sound that's going on in this particular track. So just to kind of run you through these real quick, this is just kind of what I've got called the rock snare, which is, it's not actually this sample. This is being used just to trigger a Modern and Massive from Get Good Drums snare sound. So just snare, copper over brass, so similar to the actual drum I used. So you get a real nice kind of snappy rock sound. Got this noise snare. Just kind of a white noise sounding snare. Now, Linkin Park used a lot of MPCs, and I think they still do to this day, for their drum production. So this is actually just an MPC sample that I found from, I believe, the Sample from Mars library, which they've got a lot of really cool sounding stuff. There's a rim shot layered in here. I just pitched this down a little bit to fit in with the other snares. Got a second white noise snare that's kind of similar to what we hear in the chorus. This has got a little bit more reverb on it, just the waves R-verb, giving it some decay. Without it, super quick. With the reverb, you got that decay. and then a snap. Exactly what it sounds like. So all of those together again sound like this. And then with the kick. And then you can see on here in the verse and right up to the chorus, this rock snare and the first noise snare that I have drop out. So then it's just these three snares going on here. And basically with that, I've also got layered in this crunch snare that's kind of on an offbeat. So we'll let you hear these. So this crunch snare really just kind of adds as a almost lead into the main snare line. And then leading right up to the chorus, that changes into this. I think I used the same sample. Nope, a little different sample. These are actually pitched differently, so it adds a little bit of variation. That's what these sound like. Just a little bit of difference, but you can kind of hear going from one section to the next. Listen to that snare change. So it gives a little bit more movement, which I found really cool just in programming these, because it's not your traditional, let's just kind of make a kick and a snare pattern, add some hi-hats and call it a day. There's a lot of forward movement that kind of creates some more velocity leading up into the chorus. And then the last part of these electronic drums that adds to that is these hi-hats. So I've got up here on the acoustic drums, I just have the actual like real hi-hats that I recorded on, just doing some notes here. So just some eighth notes on the hi-hats, nothing complicated. But we have those going along with some 16th note hi-hats. Play this section. And then also some quarter note hi-hats. And what's cool about these is these are panned opposite each other, so playing just the hi-hats themselves, you get a little bit more stereo dimension with that, but you get that kind of sense of a groove in there because you've got 16ths playing in your left ear, and then you've got your quarter notes playing in your right ear. And then if you add in the eighth notes of the real hi-hats, it gives a really nice kind of hybrid theory, one might say, of just drum programming, because you've got the acoustic and the electronic drums creating that groove and adding to it. And then you can see that these 16th notes duck out in the first half of the chorus. They start coming back in on the second half of the chorus, the verse, excuse me. And they start coming back in on the second half of the verse. And I've got an auto filter, which you can hear these kind of sweep back in. And then these quarter note hi-hats actually change in pitch. So again, you can hear that filter. It's really just EQing out some of the highs, and then those come back in as it gets to the pre-chorus just to add more movement. And then if I let this play through with the drums, we'll let that come back in with the live drums, and you can hear how seamlessly these transition, which is something that Linkin Park's really good about doing. So as a drummer, I found this really interesting to recreate because, like I mentioned, when I was a teenager hearing this, there was no disassociation from me between thinking like, oh, this is definitely an electronic drum set or drum samples, and this is an acoustic drum set. I just played all of this on a drum set, and I think that's to a degree what they do live. But on the recorded version, at least, it's really neat to me how they managed to separate the two, but have them sound similar enough. And again, some of that was through just adding a little bit of grit, just to make those sound a little bit less clean that you would get out of just stock drum samples from an MPC or any kind of drum sampler. But a lot of that is also due to the drum programming. So you would naturally play as a drummer, you would naturally play things a little louder. You'd add in things as you're ramping up into the chorus. So that was really important to kind of program in as Linkin Park was writing this, because it gives it more of a human feel, despite these being, literally all just quantized straight to the grid is what I had these programmed out for. And I think lastly, the only thing I'm really doing of interest kind of on here is on these 16th note hi-hats. You can kind of hear them pulsing a little bit. I've just got this tremolator here. All that really does is kind of pulse it so that you really hear that first note a little louder than the rest. So it makes it kind of feel like you're actually have a live drummer kind of accenting that first note on those 16ths. So if we go back and play up to the pre-chorus here and unmute that, you can hear now we've got this synth coming in. Things right here that I've got labeled as synth plucks. And this is something that only comes in on the 2 pre-choruses. So it's a pretty dry sound. Normally my approach with synthesizers like this, or just little synth leads, particularly plucks, respond really well to reverbs and delays to make them sound wider. But because of this particular song, these are pretty dry sounding synth plucks on here. I've just got a patch, I think, from Hybrid Keys in Native Instruments. Yep, Hybrid Keys. Nothing too fancy here. I think I just tweaked the preset a little bit without the effects. Just sounds like that. Added some compression. Distorted them a little bit. Then EQ'd out some of the high frequencies. And then I'm sending this to a little bit reverb here. So unmute the reverb with the reverb. So that was a cool just little electronic element to add into there, to just add a little bit more excitement leading into the chorus, which again, is just a great songwriting technique to add in little nods and little kind of sonic ear candy just going into the bigger part, so that when it opens up into the chorus, you're kind of prepared for it and it's ramping up and creating anticipation. And then the other synthesizer thing, I've got these 16th note plucks, which are panned just about halfway to the right. It's just a saw wave pluck that I'm slightly modulating the filter cutoff. I think I've got this just kind of automated in volume throughout different points of the songs. But this is really just kind of a pulsating rhythm that, again, kind of adds a little bit more rhythmic just involvement overall throughout the song. This isn't playing in the chorus. It is playing, I believe, in the final outro. But other than that, it's pretty much just in the verses there to add a little bit more excitement. And then the last couple things, obviously the lead for Crawling. This, I believe, was just a patch or a sample that they found, I think, on an MPC. From what I remember seeing them play this live, he plays it on a drum pad. So I tried to recreate this as best I could. Given more time, I feel like I could have gotten a little closer, but I feel like this is close enough. It sounded really, to me, just like kind of a basic triangle wave, so that's what I started out with. So if I mute the effects, just fairly simple sounding triangle wave. It's got a little bit, again, of a filter modulation, so it just opens up when the note's being played. Running this through an amp to give it a little bit more distortion, help it kind of poke through the mix. And funnily enough, this is the Ableton model of the Mesa Boogie dual rectifier, which we're also using on the guitars. So I found that kind of interesting that fits. I was playing around between that and the decapitator, but I actually like the sound of the amp a little better. Adding some EQ to cut out some of the high end above 10K or so. Got a little shrill. And then just adding some reverb. And then I've got a little bit short piano sample here, just layered in with that. Does sound kind of piano-esque, so I didn't want to lean fully into just having a piano note. So that piano is really just there, kind of tucked a little bit underneath the actual triangle wave, just to give it a little bit more kind of body to it. And then lastly, the only real kind of sound effects that I'm using that were fun to kind of recreate was at the beginning of this song, you hear this kind of swirling effect, and it almost sounds like it's somebody taking like a metal bowl and a spoon and just kind of circling it and adding some reverb. So without re-recording that, I just found a patch that sounded somewhat similar and just kind of put a bunch of effects on it and automated the cutoff. So here's what this sounds like, and I'll let you hear this in the context. You can see I've got an auto filter that I just drew in. So this is just kind of filtering certain frequencies. You can see the crazy kind of automation just going on in there. Added some reverb. Then I've got another filter delay that's playing around with the left and the right channels too, just giving it a little bit of just kind of weirdness because it's a weird sound. This sound really only comes in the beginning and the end of the song right here. You can kind of hear it to a small degree during verse 2 in the pre-chorus. So I've got that kind of tucked a little lower in there, and it just kind of acts as a pad to give, a little bit more movement in that kind of frequency spectrum. And then last, we have the scratching from the turntables that comes in the intro. I don't have a turntable, nor am I a turntablist, so I didn't even attempt to do that live. I just found some samples that I kind of messed around with, chopped up, and resampled into Ableton, and came up with this, which almost kind of sounds more like a siren to me, but, close enough, right? Oh. So again, just chopped up some samples. And that's pretty much it as far as the sounds go. So yeah, we've got a couple weird effects there. Mixing, again, I've got on my master bus, nothing that I've really done too different than my other videos. Running it through some compression so we can hear this on the last chorus here. I'll just let this kind of play. Some compression when the snare hits. Adding in some tape, Universal Audio Studer A800, which sounds great. This is actually a modified kind of preset of hi-fi shine, so I've got a little bit of a high frequency bump in here, and this kind of rounds off some of the transients as well for the snares and the electronic drums. And then mastering, again, just doing some mid-side EQ with the Hitsville mastering EQ from Universal Audio, running it through a little bit more compression, slower attack, automatic release, so it's not quite as aggressive. It's really just kind of compressing the whole thing a little bit more. And then just adding some multi-band compression and some limiting here. Just keeping everything kind of in rough balance. And really the last thing that I can think of in here, so the arrangement is really cool in this. It's nothing, super out of the ordinary. You've got your intro, you've got your hook or your chorus coming in, pre-verse, verse, ramps back up into the chorus. You got your verse 2, and then it finishes out with the chorus. The chorus is basically repeated 3 times, and from the first and second, it's relatively similar. I think it adds in some synth elements, if I'm not incorrect. Okay, it's not until the outro. So this last outro part here, you come back in with the crawling intro, the kind of piano sounding lead, and then the 16th note plucks. But what was interesting in here is that you can hear on the guitars where I've got the octaves playing for the Mesa Boogie amps, you can hear on this just, I believe, playing 8th note. So 1, 2, 3, 4. In the outro, this goes into double time. It goes into 16th notes. So 1, 2, and a 3, and a 4, and a 1. So this goes into double time, which is cool because it adds a little bit enough of a variation, and then it ends strong in this part. back to the metal bowl swirling. So I had a lot of fun recreating this. This was super interesting look into Linkin Park's just writing process and production process. Like I said, I found the drum programming really interesting just because they've got a really cool approach to making it sound human despite just using drum samples, which is something I find really interesting as a drummer, and then being able to incorporate that seamlessly going into the live drums. The guitar sound is great. Just combining amps is always fun to do. And this particular sound is that kind of nu metal sound that, you know, this band and several others are known for, that they've kind of pioneered. And then just overall, the songwriting structure, learning how they're arranging certain elements and creating the intensity going from a chorus where you've got, you know, all things kind of maxed out at 10, dipping down into the verse where it's got a little more of a mellow feel, ramping up in the pre-chorus, adding in a little bit more of an electronic element and feel, and then coming back into the chorus, just again, cranking everything up to 10. And then the outro is really just taking that last thing and turning it up to 11, basically, because you're adding in some other parts of the song that were not previously in the chorus. So yeah, this was a lot of fun to make. Please let me know if you have any questions or any suggestions or anything in the comments, or what you'd like to see next. I'm super excited to hear what Linkin Park comes out with next. This and Meteora were two of my favorite albums growing up, and are still two of my favorite albums to this day that really kind of shaped my musical influences. So I'm going to let this song play all the way through from just start to finish. And again, thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe if you liked the video, and I hope to see you on the next one. Thanks. Cheers.